For far too long, our nation has ignored the voices of Black women.
We must ensure your is counted and that
Candace Owens thought she had the crowd laughing, but in seconds the laughter froze. It began with a smirk, the kind that stretches wider when it senses an easy win. The stage lights cut down sharply, bleaching the edges of her expression, and every word dripped like acid meant to corrode the woman sitting across from her. The audience chuckled, not cruelly at first, more out of reflex, more out of habit, because Candace had trained them to expect the punchline. But something shifted. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Not once. Her eyes fixed steady, unbothered, as if the insults fluttered past her like moths against glass. No roll of the shoulders, no visible wound. Just composure so unnerving it began to unspool the room's rhythm. You could see it in the micro-expressions, the man in the third row who paused mid-laugh, the woman clutching her phone as if she suddenly needed to record, the quiet hush of people sensing they'd just stumbled into something different. Candace leaned forward, expecting her jab to land like it always did. She pressed harder, voice dipped in mockery, aiming for the cheap applause. But Crockett's silence was louder. That quiet became oxygen, fueling anticipation, turning every second into a countdown. Then it happened. Crockett leaned in, not with rage but with razor calm, and delivered a line so precise, so measured, that the room itself recoiled. The chuckles died, swallowed by a stunned stillness. A beat later the sound came, not laughter, not heckles, but applause. Applause that didn't just reject Owens's punchline but crowned Crockett as the master of the stage. Candace blinked, smile trembling. For once, her rhythm faltered. The confidence, rehearsed and armored, cracked in plain sight. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. They were leaning toward Jasmine, drawn into composure that cut sharper than any insult. This wasn't just a clapback, it was a collapse in real time. But here's the twist: Crockett's words weren't only about Candace. They spoke to something bigger, something the audience didn't realize they were waiting to hear until it hit them square in the chest. And to understand why Candace's laughter turned to silence so brutally, we need to rewind. To understand why the room froze that night, you have to see the battlefield long before the first words were exchanged. This wasn't just a stage with two women behind microphones. It was a clash of ideologies dressed as entertainment, a collision of worldviews compressed into a single spotlight. On one side stood Candace Owens, polished in her signature precision, a sharp tongue sharpened by years of sparring on conservative stages, where provocation isn't a side effect but the main currency. She knew her audience, knew how to toss red meat with the flick of a phrase. Every smirk, every sarcastic cut was calculated, the kind of rhetoric that earns viral applause from one side of the aisle and furious rebuttals from the other. She thrived on outrage the way some people thrive on oxygen. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a figure of striking contrast. Where Owens leaned into fire, Crockett carried steel. Disciplined, sharp-witted, yet often underestimated by opponents who mistook restraint for softness. She wasn't a stranger to conflict. Her career had been built on walking into hostile arenas and refusing to surrender ground. But unlike Owens, her weapon wasn't volume. It was precision. Measured words that cut cleaner than shouting ever could. That night, the stage itself became a metaphor for America. Two women, two visions. One leaned into chaos, proud of the mess it stirred. The other leaned into composure, betting on clarity to win out over noise. The lights didn't just illuminate faces, they illuminated a deeper divide. A cultural split broadcast to millions, live and waiting to pounce on every word. And the audience, they weren't neutral bystanders. Every chuckle, every gasp was amplified beyond those walls. People in the crowd weren't just spectators, they were live reporters, phones angled high, ready to make any moment immortal with a swipe and a post. What was said on that stage would not stay on that stage. It would ricochet across timelines, stitched into TikToks, turned into memes, dissected in threads until even those who hadn't watched felt like they had been there. Twitter, X, Instagram, YouTube, these weren't sidelines. They were battlegrounds running parallel to the microphones, shaping perception in real time. A well-placed phrase could become a trending hashtag before the applause even faded, and both Owens and Crockett knew it. This was bigger than ego, bigger than one debate. For Owens, the goal was domination, remind her base why she's untouchable, why her wit keeps challengers trembling. For Crockett, the mission was survival at first, but also something more, to prove that dignity doesn't crumble under mockery. That calm can outshine chaos. The tension wasn't about what would be said, it was about which vision of America would walk off the stage intact. You could feel it humming beneath the laughter, even in the silence between jabs. Every smirk, every pause, every look across the table carried weight far heavier than personal rivalry. It wasn't just Candace against Jasmine, It was two strategies for power, two cultural codes, fighting for dominance in the space of a few sentences. And while the audience expected fireworks, no one predicted who would get burned. Candace Owens did not stumble into her reputation. She carved it with sharpened words. Long before this stage, she had become known as a kind of stage assassin, wielding sarcasm as both blade and shield. Her rise wasn't about policy papers or nuanced arguments, it was about spectacle, about the art of turning opposition into punchlines. She mastered the rhythm of interruption, the perfectly timed smirk, the sting that left her rivals flustered while the audience roared. For years it worked. Panels, podcasts, debates, Owens thrived in arenas where confidence meant more than coherence. The louder her opponents grew, the calmer she stayed, twisting their frustration into proof of her dominance. She built a brand on the humiliation of others, each verbal victory another brick in her platform. But here's the irony. The very weapon that made her untouchable also set her up for collapse. Sarcasm depends on control. It relies on the target flinching, reacting, or stumbling into the trap. Without that reaction, the punchline falls flat and the laughter curdles into silence. And silence is exactly what awaited her. Owens thought she had seen every kind of opponent, angry, emotional, even brilliant ones who could spar at her speed. But she had never faced someone like Jasmine Crockett, someone who wouldn't rise to the bait, who wouldn't hand her the reaction she needed, someone who could make silence louder than sarcasm. What Owens didn't know that night was simple. Her trademark smirk, her blade of wit, her armor of arrogance, all of it would be turned against her. The stage assassin was walking into her own trap. Owens thought she'd seen every opponent. She hadn't faced Crockett. Jasmine Crockett's story was never one of easy applause. From the beginning, she walked into rooms where her presence was doubted before she ever spoke. She knew the look, the half-smile that said you're not ready for this, the raised eyebrow that measured her competence before she opened her mouth. Underestimated, dismissed, quietly written off. And yet, she never flinched. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Instead, she built her voice like stone, steady and deliberate, word by word. If Owens thrived on spectacle, Crockett thrived on patience, on choosing moments carefully, on refusing to let arrogance dictate her rhythm. But that calm often drew its own frustration. Too many mistook her composure for weakness, her silence for surrender. They assumed that if she wasn't playing the game of volume, she wasn't playing at all. That mistake became her shadow, an endless cycle of underestimation. Each time she held her ground, opponents doubled down, louder, harsher, desperate to rattle the woman who wouldn't rattle. What they didn't see was that the quiet was her preparation, the calm before the strike. Her frustration wasn't anger at being underestimated. It was the burden of always having to prove. Again and again, that strength doesn't need spectacle. That fire doesn't always rage, sometimes it waits. And on that stage, Owens made the same error countless others had made. She mistook calm for weakness. She mistook silence for surrender. And that mistake would detonate on stage. Candace Owens struck first. Her voice carried the ease of someone who had played this role 100 times before. Smug, sharpened, every syllable designed to draw a laugh. She leaned into the microphone and tossed out her line, not even looking at Jasmine Crockett as much as through her, like the opponent was already beneath the punchline. The crowd obliged. Chuckles rolled forward, some sharp, some hesitant, like the reflex of an audience trained to laugh before they even processed the insult. Candace thrived on that reflex. It was her weapon and her comfort, proof that the room still belonged to her. But then came the pause. That crucial beat where the target is expected to flinch, to protest, to stumble. Owens waited for it, almost savoring it, her smirk stretching like a predator certain of the outcome. Crockett gave her nothing. No twitch, no break, no visible reaction. Just steady eyes and a silence that felt heavier with each second. At first, the audience didn't notice. But silence has a strange power. It begins as background, then grows louder than any laugh. One man's chuckle died mid-breath. A woman in the second row tilted her head, studying Crockett like she had just noticed the stillness of a storm about to break. Candace sensed it too. Her smirk faltered, just barely, before she doubled down. She lobbed another line. Sharper this time, her tone dipped in mockery meant to rattle. Again, the audience offered polite laughter, though softer now, tinged with unease. Crockett didn't move. The stillness spread, bending the atmosphere of the room. The crowd shifted in their seats, some uncomfortable, others transfixed. It was as though they were waiting for Crockett to finally answer, holding their breath, unsure if they were watching restraint or preparation. Outside the hall, the internet was already alive. Clips of Candace's barbs hit timelines within minutes. TikToks with captions like, Owens cooking Crockett, racked up early views. Twitter feeds filled with gifs of Candace's smirk, the first wave of memes crowning her queen of the moment. But buried under the noise, a second current began. Screenshots of Crockett's unflinching stare circulated, people asking, why isn't she reacting? And, look at that face. She's plotting something. The silence was spreading digitally just as it had in the room, reframed as suspense rather than defeat. Back on stage, Candace's rhythm grew restless. She reached for yet another jab, but this time the audience's reaction fractured. A few laughed too loudly, trying to keep the old rhythm alive, while others hesitated, caught between loyalty to the spectacle and the undeniable tension pressing in. And still, Crockett waited. Her silence had become a performance, a living counterpoint to Candace's barrage. Every second stretched like a rubber band, pulled tighter, the audience aware it would snap. They just didn't know when. Owens tried to fill the silence with her own laughter, but even that began to sound forced. She leaned back, shrugged, feigned amusement at Crockett's composure, but the act rang hollow. The crowd wasn't laughing with her anymore. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Online, the shift was becoming undeniable. Hashtags #FlipFatCrockettSilent trended not as mockery but as prophecy. Users posted countdown GIFs, waiting for her response. The silence itself had become content, suspense packaged in every retweet. In the room, the wait was unbearable. The chuckles had turned to murmurs, the murmurs into stillness. The stage lights seemed harsher now, spotlighting the sweat beginning to bead at Candace's temples. For the first time, her control wasn't absolute, and then Crockett finally spoke. The silence was shattered with a single voice, Jasmine Crockett's, not loud, not hurried, calm, precise, a voice that didn't need volume because it carried weight. Candace. She began, her tone almost conversational. It's interesting how often you mistake ridicule for truth. The words landed softly, but the impact was seismic. A ripple went through the crowd, not laughter, not applause, but a sharp intake of breath. People leaned forward. For the first time that night, Candace Owens wasn't the conductor of the room. Owens tried to cut in, flashing her trademark smirk. Oh, please, Jasmine. But Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her next sentence sliced through the interruption like glass. You perform arrogance as if it were evidence. But tonight, the performance isn't holding. That was the crack, the precise fault line beneath Owens's entire persona. The audience felt it. The tension snapped into nervous laughter, a scattered sound that betrayed recognition. Crockett wasn't just answering, she was dismantling. Candace sat back, her smirk stiffening, her eyes scanning the audience for reassurance. But the crowd had shifted. Their gaze had left her, locked instead on Crockett, waiting for the next move. And Crockett delivered. Here's the irony, she continued, still poised, each word steady. You claim to expose hypocrisy. You've built a career on pointing out contradictions. But the problem with living by the clapback is that eventually someone will hold up a mirror. The audience erupted. Not full applause yet, but gasps, nods, murmurs like the rising hum of a stadium before the first score. On social media, phones are whipped up in the air, recording, live streaming, and captioning. Within minutes, TikTok edits appeared with slow-motion replays, Candace's smirk freezing, Crockett's words replayed with booming sound effects. On Twitter, a trending tag emerged, a mirror moment. Owens leaned forward, determined to regain control. If your best argument is to attack my style instead of substance, then maybe you don't have much to say. Her voice was sharper now, the calm cracking at the edges. Crockett tilted her head, almost sympathetic. But that is the substance, Candace. Style is your argument. You don't come to these stages with policy. You come with punchlines, and tonight they're not landing. The crowd exploded. Laughter this time, not nervous but jubilant, applause cutting through the hall. Owens's face twitched, and for the first time the smirk faltered entirely. Candace attempted a pivot. She waved her hand dismissively, tried to reset. See, this is exactly what liberals do. They don't debate ideas, they just try to shame the people who are actually brave enough to speak the truth. It might have worked. Except Crockett was ready. No, she replied, calm as ever. Debating ideas means bringing some to the table. All I've heard from you tonight is recycled outrage dressed up as bravery, real courage. That's refusing to hide behind mockery when people's lives are at stake. The crowd was on its feet now, some clapping, some hollering, the energy shifting irreversibly. Candace's attempt at recovery had crumbled. Every word Crockett spoke wasn't just countering, it was reframing the entire night. On YouTube, clips of the exchange looped endlessly. Owens delivering her jab, the audience laughing, then Crockett's calm face as the laughter froze, followed by her takedown lines. The thumbnails screamed, Owens silenced on stage, and Crockett ends it with one line. Millions of views rolled in before the night was over. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Owens, the picture of composure. "You wanted to make me the punchline. But here's the truth, Candace, people are tired of being laughed at. They're tired of their struggles reduced to memes, their pain turned into applause lines. You've mistaken cruelty for clarity. And that's why the room isn't with you anymore." This time, the applause was thunderous. Standing ovations rippled from row to row. Candace's shoulders stiffened, her eyes darting, searching for an ally in the sea of faces, but none came. Her attempt to smirk again looked hollow, like an actor clinging to a script that no longer worked. She opened her mouth, but the words stumbled, tangled in the roar of the crowd. Her voice, once commanding, now sounded small, and Crockett pressed on, still without raising hers. "I don't need to shout, I don't need to mock, because composure is stronger than cruelty. And tonight, everyone here just saw the proof." The audience erupted again, louder than before, a tidal wave of applause that drowned out whatever Candace tried to muster in response. The stage that had once been her arena now belonged fully unmistakably to Jasmine Crockett. On TikTok, creators stitched reactions to the moment, gasps, laughter, and commentary layered over the viral clip. On Instagram, reels carried captions like, "Candace's worst night ever" and "the calmest takedown in history." The internet wasn't debating who won, it was replaying how Candace lost. By the end, Candace's smirk had vanished, and so had her control of the stage. Word count 103s, just a touch over the fun 100 target to keep the rhythm clean. Candace Owens wasn't finished. Not yet. Her body stiffened in her chair, chin tilted upward as if posture alone could reclaim authority. She leaned into her microphone, ready to bulldoze her way back into control. "Now hold on," she snapped, her tone sharper, louder, desperate to cut through the rising wave of applause for Crockett. But the audience wasn't with her. A collective groan rolled across the hall, low and unmistakable. It wasn't the laughter she once commanded, it was rejection, the sound of a crowd tiring of the same performance. For the first time, Candace was the interruption, not the show. Crockett sat still, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush. She let the groan echo, let Owens feel it, let silence carve the difference between control and collapse. Then, with the precision of a scalpel, she spoke. "You see, Candace," Crockett said evenly, "the reason you keep talking over people is because you're terrified of what happens when you stop." The words detonated. The audience burst, first with gasps, then laughter, then cheers that thundered through the room. It was the killer line, the kind that instantly becomes legend. Owens's weapon of interruption had been turned into the very proof of her weakness. Owens tried to laugh it off, but the laugh rang hollow. It wasn't joined by the crowd. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The smirks once aimed at Crockett now curved against Owens. People weren't laughing with her, they were laughing at her. Phones tilted higher, capturing every flicker of Candace's faltering expression. Within minutes, the clip was already climbing online. Hashtags multiplied to terrified to stop, but Crockett cut steep. Comment sections exploded with one-liners. "This is the end of Candace's smirk era." Crockett didn't raise her voice, she raised the stakes. Owens tried once more, her words clipped, rushed. "You're dodging the real issues, Jasmine." But the damage was done. Each attempt to reassert herself sounded like scrambling. Crockett, meanwhile, sat anchored, her composure an unshakable contrast. "Dodging," she repeated softly. "I'm not the one ducking substance. I'm not the one hiding behind laughter while real people struggle." Her voice never wavered, yet the authority in it filled the room. Applause detonated again, louder, longer, a roar that made further interruption impossible. Owens leaned back, eyes flashing, but the mask had slipped too far. Her crown, the smirk, the dominance, the command, was gone. The crowd wasn't witnessing a debate anymore. They were witnessing a collapse. And more than that, they were witnessing a coronation. The Queen of Composure had reclaimed her crown, not by volume or spectacle, but by exposing the hollowness of arrogance itself. Online, the ripple effect grew into a tidal wave. On Twitter, side-by-side memes popped up, one frame of Owens mid-smirk, the next frame of her frozen after Crockett's line. On TikTok, users lipped since Crockett's words, the punchline looping over beats and remixes. Commenters called it the line of the year. The exact second the power dynamic flipped. By the time the applause died down, everyone in the room knew it. Owens hadn't just lost a debate, she had been unmasked in real time. It was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. The stage belonged to Jasmine Crockett now. She didn't rise, didn't need to. The dignity of composure had already carried her further than volume ever could. When the moderator signaled the debate's close, she simply folded her notes, stood with measured calm, and exited to the sound of applause that seemed to follow her all the way offstage. Candace Owens remained seated a moment too long. Her silence wasn't strategic anymore, it was forced, pressed upon her by a crowd that had shifted allegiance in real time. For once, she had no quip, no ready-made smirk to disguise the sting. She gathered her papers quickly, eyes low, her brisk exit almost hidden by the thunder still chasing Crockett out the door. Outside the hall, the fallout ignited instantly. Clips of Crockett's dismantling response exploded across timelines. TikTok edits spliced Candace's smirk with the moment it vanished, tagged with captions like "Arrogance meets silence" and "Calm chaos." Twitter threads broke down the exchange frame by frame, praising the sharpness of Crockett's words and the devastating precision of her delivery. Think pieces appeared overnight. Opinion writers hailed Crockett as a new archetype, proof that restraint could be more lethal than outrage. In that moment, one headline read, "Jasmine Crockett wasn't just answering Owens, she was answering every voice that ever tried to belittle her." Owens, meanwhile, scrambled. Her team pushed clips that cut off before the clapback, tried to spin the debate as heated but fair. Yet even allies admitted the narrative was out of her hands. The internet had already declared the verdict, and the court of public opinion rarely reverses once a meme has taken root. For Crockett, it was never about Candace Owens alone. She became a symbol, an embodiment of what happens when composure meets arrogance and doesn't flinch. Viewers across the spectrum, even those who disagreed with her politics, shared the clips in admiration of her poise. It wasn't just a win, it was a cultural moment. And that cultural moment carried its own charge. The crowd that had once laughed with Candace now replayed the footage to laugh at her. The digital tide that once crowned her queen of sharp comebacks now marked her as the example of what happens when confidence curdles into hubris. But Crockett's triumph wasn't loud. It was lasting. The strength of silence, the power of timing, the elegance of refusing to wrestle in the mud. These became her weapons. And in using them, she shifted the stage itself. The audience left with one lingering question. If Candace Owens, practiced and sharp, could be undone in seconds, who else might fall to the same force? Because the viral stage doesn't forgive arrogance, and the next reckoning may already be waiting. Candace Owens walked onto that stage thinking she held the upper hand, that her sharp tongue and practiced wit would turn the room against Jasmine Crockett. But by the end, it was Candace who sat in silence. Her own smirk erased, her own stage conquered. She tried to embarrass Jasmine, but in doing so, she embarrassed only herself. And that is the lesson this moment carried far beyond the lights of that hall. Arrogance can draw laughter, but it cannot hold power. Dignity, calm, steady, unshaken, always survives the storm. Crockett didn't win by shouting louder, she won by refusing to break, by letting silence sharpen the weight of her words until the truth cut deeper than any insult. If you were sitting in that room, whose side would you have taken? Would you have laughed with Candace, or stood with Jasmine when she turned the tide? Drop your reaction in the comments below. Was this the coldest clapback of the year? And if you believe, like we do, that calm will always crush chaos, then hit subscribe and join this movement of voices who refuse to be silenced. Because if one viral moment can rewrite the stage, imagine what will happen in the next debate.